Good evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your kind introduction. It is a real honor for me to talk to you today, especially in this fantastic museum. Years ago we came here, my wife and myself, and were just overwhelmed by this architecture being art at the same time, like a dome of art in itself. It's just a wonderful place. And I'm very happy to talk about Europe, the crisis of Europe, the possibility of Europe, even if I'm not happy about the crisis of Europe. Well, everybody asks, is there a real crisis of Europe? You have to know that Europe always was in crisis. Actually, crisis is another word for Europe. So, and we could say that crisis was actually a motor for progress in Europe. But today, it seems to be different. There are deep concerns. Could things really get bad? I mean, bad as in the 20th century, as in the first half of the 20th century. If the euro explodes, Europe could explode, said President Sarkozy of France recently. It's a guarantee of peace in a continent where there have been terrible wars. I have lived my entire life in a world in which, for all its ups and downs, things seemed to be getting better, steadily better. Nazism has been defeated. Dictatorships fell in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. The Soviet Empire collapsed. Apartheid ended in South Africa. Since the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in 2008, and especially since the euro crisis, we have discovered that things definitely get worse. And one of the questions, one of the concerns, not only I, but many have, is this: how worse can they get? But this is not the question I want to discuss today. There's a second question, and this is the one I am asking and discussing here. Europe already accomplished a miracle once before. Enemies became neighbors. In the light of the euro crisis, the cardinal question must be confronted once again. How can Europe guarantee its citizens peace, freedom, and security in the risk storms of the globalized world? This calls for nothing less than a second miracle. How can the euro crisis become an opportunity to enlarge democracy in Europe? I want to discuss three questions. My first question is, what actually do we mean by Europe? Why is Europe a necessity? Second, is there a new logic of power getting shape in Europe in reaction to the euro crisis? And third, is the euro crisis, the euro crisis is not just about economy, but about initiating maybe a Europeanization from below. Let's create a Europe of the citizens now. Well, what is Europe actually about? What do we mean by Europe? Why is Europe a necessity? Let me first give you a metaphor. Europe is like scrambled eggs. If you try to divide them into white and yellow, you will fail. If you try to divide them into national or regional identity and European identity, you will fail. And this is exactly what people try to do right now. Second, globalization is the question, and Europe is the answer. What do we mean by globalization? Globalization is quite a vague term, quite a broad term, and to many people it's actually an enemy image. There are different dimensions of globalization which we have to distinguish. Most people understand globalization as economic globalization, especially as a globalized force of capital, and therefore a lot of problems raising for workers and people who live in specific areas. But this is only one meaning, and of course it is a very important one. At the same time, globalization has a cultural meaning and a political meaning, different dimensions and dynamics. The social sciences, at least those who really concentrated on the questions of globalization since the last 10 years, do have a very specific and interesting answer what globalization is about. And actually this is one of the answers which most of the people agree upon, and this is quite seldom in social science. It is the answer that globalization is about interconnectedness. Interconnectedness beyond borders in many dimensions. We are interconnected by the decisions others make in different regions, by institutions, by the implications of radical modernizations, for example, global risks, and so on. All of this is an extraordinary experience of interdependence. And if you ask what is actually the essence, the sociological essence of this interdependence, of this interconnectedness, I think this is an important question to be asked, and the answer seems to be quite simple, but it's actually a very difficult answer. Interconnectedness, if you look at the sociological consequences of interconnectedness, you find out that the global other, which is excluded, is actually becoming part of our own life. The other which is excluded, the other in different regions, the other in different geographical contexts and different national, cultural contexts, is becoming part of our own life. This is true in relation to, for example, global risks, where decisions of others, or now decisions in relation to the euro crisis of different nations, are becoming part of our own life, and we have to cope with this new challenge. Globalization is a very general term, and I would like to call this consequence of globalization cosmopolitization. Cosmopolitization, the term cosmopolitization, the concept of cosmopolitization has a long history in Western thought. It has parallel history in different cultural contexts as well, but it's a very old concept which actually was created in Greek philosophy and became very important again during the Enlightenment, where all actually European intellectuals, to one amount or the other, discussed how cosmopolitanism and nationalism and patriotism are being combined, and what the contradictions between those different concepts really are. But this is not actually the meaning, or not only the meaning I have in mind. This is a meaning which goes from, this is a concept which goes from Greek philosophy to Immanuel Kant, to Jürgen Habermas, which actually, those are only the German names I'm taking to illustrate this concept of ideas, but there are many others as well. There's a different discussion of cosmopolitization going on in relation to globalization all over in different disciplines, and especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, which has a different meaning. It refers somehow to this normative meaning, but it's more about facts. It's about something which happens to people even if they don't want it to happen. It's not just an elite subject as the philosophy of cosmopolitan. It's an everyday subject, and this is what I call cosmopolitization. Cosmopolitization is an empirical process where people are experiencing the interconnectedness of their lives, the new mixtures of cultures in their own experience, like we do in the relationship of global financial crisis and many other aspects. This is actually what I call in Germany, Weltinnenpolitik. This is a new title of my book. It's quite difficult to translate it into English and maybe even into Spanish and Basque as well. It's about the reality in which we live, in which interior politics and global politics and foreign politics cannot be separated anymore, because we have a mixture of those two ways of politics. This is the same is true in relation to Europe. European politics is internal politics at the same time, external and internal at the same time. It is, as I said, it is scrambled eggs. You cannot separate it anymore. This is actually the main metaphor for all the issues we have in relating to Europe and to many other subjects. So the answer to globalization, the answer to global risks is not just sticking to the national context. It's not, there's no national answer to global risks. There's no national answer to global risks. I think we have to realize this is a very important issue. Not only global risks, but all kinds of problems are interconnected now, and we don't have national answers, not local answers. I come back to this, or regional answers either. But there is a necessity to cooperate. There's a necessity to cooperate beyond borders. And this cooperation beyond borders is not something in which the national or regional units of politics and cultures have to lose their identity and their sovereignty, but they can gain their sovereignty and their identity in relation to global issues, because they are not able to handle those global issues on the national level by themselves. The only way to do it is by increasing and pooling sovereignty with others. Take those others in for your own interest, and therefore find solutions to transnational problems. So to give you another metaphor, metaphors are, to me at least, very important, because we are living in a time where our concepts really don't work anymore, and we need metaphors in order to understand, and then we can build new concepts on the background of those metaphors. And another metaphor for cosmopolitization or cosmopolitanism in this new meaning is having roots and wings at the same time. Having roots and wings at the same time. Being rooted, being in a tradition, but not only in a tradition, not closing up in this tradition, may it be a national, regional, or what tradition whatsoever, but open up to the others. Being able to cooperate, being able to include the other in your own national or regional identity. Well, many people say when I'm talking about this argument, and I can assure you I can take endlessly about this argument. You will be tired after a while, because it's just my subject and I like to talk about it. But afterwards, always the question comes up, isn't it an idealistic vision you have? Isn't it an utopia you're talking about? Because people are still pretty much concerned in their local and national identity, and they don't want to be cosmopolitan, they don't want to open up. I would say it's just the opposite around. It's just the opposite around. The national context, nationalism is the utopia nowadays. And it's even a utopia which is backward orientated. It doesn't have any answer. It doesn't have any answer to the main questions of concern. If you just concentrate on yourself and keep the others out, you don't have an answer to the interconnected, globalized, cosmopolitanized world. On the other hand, the answer is not only global institutions. Cosmopolitanism doesn't mean that there has to be one global institution solving all problems for all people of the world. Of course, nobody really thinks this is possible, but sometimes you get the idea that some people think this is the idea we are looking for. And even if you look at a colleague of mine, which I really admire, Jürgen Habermas, he is thinking in this direction. We have to have global solutions for global problems. I think this doesn't work either. Because then we have a centralized, universalized power structure, which actually nobody really wants. So we can start in all kinds of areas. We can start on the nation-state level, we can start on the regional level, but we always need a kind of cooperation in order to make the specific contribution in the specific cultural background we have worthwhile and taking part in the cooperation between others. Our thinking is very much captured by the national point of view. Our thinking. Everything good is connected to the nation state. Democracy is connected to the nation. The state is connected to the nation state. Everything is connected to the nation state. This is the historical background. I say the social sciences captured by what I call methodological nationalism. They equate the nation state with society. They compare, without even reflecting upon it, they say this is our unit of research, and we are looking at social inequality of class, of whatsoever ethnic identity or religious orientations from a national point, not from a national point of view, but using the national unit of research. And when we do make comparisons, we compare different national units. This is methodological nationalism, and methodological nationalism does have its positive implications. Sometimes it's even necessary to do it, but you cannot really capture the interconnectedness. You cannot really capture the interconnectedness, the new reality of a cosmopolitanized world we live in. And this is actually the case which is so important to understand Europe. The national point of view sees two ways and only two ways of reading European politics and integration. It sees it either as a federation leading to a federal superstate, or as intergovernmentalism leading to a federation of states. Both models are empirically inadequate. They fail to grasp essential things both about present-day Europe and about the nations they make up. But they are also, in a deep structural sense, anti-European. They deny the goal most worth to attending a cosmopolitan Europe of diversity, a Europe that helps diversity to flourish and to be acknowledged. You know, when you look at European integration from a national point of view, Europe has to be a nation writ large. It has to be, it has to be a demos writ large, it has to be a nation writ large, it has to be one culture, one language, and exactly this isn't what Europe is about. You miss the important new quality of Europe, which is the diversity of different cultures, political cultures, traditions, ways of interpreting democracy and so on and so on. And this is what Europe is about. So we cannot just stay on the national level. We even do understand the member states wrongly. We don't understand the member states if we say they are still national states. They are not national states anymore. They are not power containers which just can be closed in order to solve all the problems, like many people believe. For example, Germans do say we have to go back from the euro to the D-Mark, to the Deutschmark. This doesn't work because we are a mixture. Again, we are scrambled eggs. This is what it means to say national categories of thought make the thought of Europe impossible. Caught up in the false alternatives of the national viewpoint, we are giving the choice between no Europe and no Europe. Europe, in the national point of view, is, to make a very strong point, to formulate it in a radical way, Europe is an enemy of the nation states because either there's Europe, a European nation, or there the other nations. So this kind of conflict, this kind of severe conflict comes up the stronger the Brussels Europe becomes. And then we find out that actually we are losing our identity. And I think this is the concern which many people, European people, have nowadays, that they are losing their identity, losing their sovereignty, losing their dignity in relation to Europeanization, because Europe seems to be a federal state, big federal state of one nation. And it isn't. It is a complete, if you try to understand Europe this way, it's just a wrong way to see the reality. If you ask what is actually the essence of Europe, then we have to say it is European law. It's not a state, it's a European law, and the European law is not being enforced by European bureaucracy. The European bureaucracy is actually smaller than bureaucracies of big cities like Berlin or Paris or something. It's a small bureaucracy. Why is it a small bureaucracy? Because the nation states are enforcing the European law. Not Europe is enforcing the law, but the nation states are enforcing the law. So there are so many specifics which have to be understood, which makes this interesting compromise between European nations and Europe specific, historically specific, which are not being normally understood in the discussions about Europe. And therefore people have a hard time of understanding what Europe is actually about. Now I come to my second question. Is there a new logic of power taking shape? Is there something like the rise of a German Euro-nationalism? In order to understand the new grammar of power, which is arising, I would use my frame of reference, which is about world risk society, global risk society. Global risk as a basic dynamics which is changing the landscapes of power all over the world in a very specific way in relation to the euro crisis. What does risk mean? Risk, I cannot give you all the answers to this. I just pick out one very small element. Risk does not mean catastrophe. Risk means the anticipation of catastrophe in the present. The catastrophe is in the future, the anticipation of and we never know if it happens or not happens. The future is unknown, basically unknown. But the anticipation of the catastrophe in the present happens and is being socially constructed, as we sociologists say, in order to prevent the catastrophe from happening. It is a self-destroying prophecy as a political or normative implication of those risk analyses. And at the same time, global risks undermine the institutions who try to control them, because those institutions have been built on the national or local level, and the global dimension of risk is beyond their scope. We don't have any institutionalized answers to global risks. We try to have them, but we don't. There's a gap, there's a contradiction between national institutions and transnational challenges and global risks. So this is true not only in relation to the national institutions, but also in relation to the European Union institutions. So this is one of the first element. The euro crisis doesn't have any institutionalized answers, because we introduced and intervented the euro without political institutions to control them or regulate them. So actually there are no institutions. This is the basic situation. And therefore actually the European Union, the institutions of the European Union are to some extent getting lost. The power is shifting to the nation states. They have the initiative, not so much the European democracy either, in the times of crisis. And here again, it's the most powerful economic nation. It's Germany, which gets a very important role. But it's not only the power structure which is changing, but it's also a new logic of power taking shape. I want to just give you a few points illustrating this. First of all, I think this is very interesting for those who are concerned with the dynamic of social inequality, class dynamics, and so on and so on. We have all over the world, and very specific in the European context, a new dynamic, I would even say an imperialistic dynamic between countries who give money and countries who need money, lender countries, and borrower countries. This is a new dynamic all over the world. For example, in relation to China and the US. Very interesting one. But it's happening in very specific ways in Europe as well. And actually, this is a kind of a new class dynamic between nations. Suddenly there's a radical inequality between those nations who give the money and those nations who have to take the money. Not only inequality, but a power structure. This is not a military, but an economic logic. So in this respect, the talk of a Fourth Reich, the Viertes Reich, is nonsense, completely nonsense. Second, its ideological foundation, the ideological foundation in Europe of this new difference between countries who give money and countries who receive money in Europe is actually what I would like to call German Euro nationalism. German Euro nationalism. That is an extended European version of Deutschmark nationalism. After the Second World War, actually the identity of Germans was very much concentrated on the Deutschmark. And it was a hard time in getting the euro as being part of the German common sense. But now suddenly the things are shifting. The euro is becoming an object of German redefinition of the Denmark. Some Germans do believe that, no, first of all, in this way, the German culture of economic stability is being extended to the European level, and being institutionalized as the main answer to the euro crisis. Stabilization of the economic power rests on the interdependence, on the dependence of the other European countries. Some Germans do believe that the German model exerts a magnetic power on the people of Europe. This is actually a background assumption which already Adenauer had in mind when he said, well, actually, Germany is so attractive to East Germany that sometimes the wall will break down and people from Eastern Germany come to Western Germany. To some extent, this might be true. I think it's not very realistic in the situation right now. There has to be an enforcement of this this power, and this is what Angela Merkel, our Chancellor, has done. She says that the price for the borrower countries is the loss of national sovereignty and, to some extent, national dignity. The consequences are really splitting the European Union. This is reflected, and this is my third point, in the new internal conflict between the Eurozone countries, the countries which have the euro, and the EU countries, the countries outside the Eurozone. Those who do not have the euro find themselves excluded from the decision-making processes which are shaping the present and future of Europe. They find themselves degraded to onlookers and are losing their political voice. The most apparent case is Great Britain, which is sliding into European irrelevance. And at the same time, this is a paradox, you know, I'm part-time Briton, I'm part-time British. I'm actually teaching at the LSE and I feel very much with the British. But for the first time since they feel they're getting irrelevant in Europe, they feel they are connected to Europe. The interconnectedness, something they are depending on Europe in many ways. Whatever the decisions in the European Union will be, they have severe implications for all the basic national concerns in Britain. But there's a second split, or this is my fourth point. I'm always getting lost in counting. This is actually my fourth point, but it's a second split. You know what I mean. I just trust you know. In the new Eurozone countries, another split comes up. And this is a split between those countries who are still on their own and those countries who are very soon depending on getting money from other countries as well. Countries which are financing the rescue funds and those who are receiving from the rescue funds. And here again, German Euro nationalism is getting important because this is the power structure in which Germany can actually say the way Europe has to go. And it's the German way of the culture of stability. There might be some truth to it. I'm not an economic expert. There are many different economic models to follow. But it's interesting that it is primarily an issue of power as well. In fact, this new imperialistic structure could have a positive side effect as well. It could overcome a mechanism which blocks decision-making in Europe. You just have to remember, 27 member states have to be convinced, not only the member states, but 27 heads of government, ministers of government, and parliaments have to be convinced in order to make a decision in Europe. And you know, this is nearly impossible, even if you look at your own family and think about how decision-making works on the evening when you have to do something real important. You never find a consensus. I bet you never do. But Europe has the principle to find a consensus between 25 nations and parliaments. I think the last time this situation was real was actually the Soviet Union, where always has to be a consensus as well. Democracy is actually about saying no and still make a decision. So I think this is actually not a very democratic procedure. We have to change it, and I think there's going to be some change happening. But at the same time, you know, we had a discussion about all kind of future models for Europe. One of the models was there have to be a community of two speeds. This was actually a model. And this is happening now, without a discussion actually. This is what is happening now. In future, only the Eurozone members, only those who have the euro, will be taking part in the decision-making process of the future of Europe. All those who are not having the euro have an alternative. Either they get the euro, then they are part of the decision-making process, which I think will be the Polish option in the near future, or some of the Eastern Europe options in the near future. Or they don't, then they're slipping into the irrelevance. A few weeks ago, one of my British colleagues said, this is a mechanism which will make even the British take over the euro. Well, I'm a bit skeptic about this, but it's an interesting new division which is coming up, because there are already the communities of two speeds, and the avant-garde of construction of new institutions will be the Eurozone countries, and maybe even those countries in the Eurozone which are not so much threatened by debt, by their own expenses, like the northern countries are more than the southern countries. This divide is an interesting one. And all the discussions which are happening now about the future building of Europe, like, do we need an economic government? What does it mean? Shall we have a government which is very much related to the Commission? Maybe the Commission could take over this role of the economic government. Should it be a new institution which we build? Should it be a combination of finance, ministers? All these are very important discussions. They are going on already, but they're all part of the discussions in the Eurozone. And Wolfgang Schäuble, I would say the most European German minister, he is actually the European, the person who is taking care of Europe, who really cares about Europe in the German government, proposes already the old idea and the very important idea on the tax of financial transactions, finance transaction tax, the Tobin tax, as has been called, and which has been proposed by social movements 20 years ago or something like. It's part of the conservative government now. It's not a neoliberal government anymore. It's looking for new regulations on the European level, maybe on the global level. And the argument, we have to wait because before all governments of the world are taking part, doesn't count anymore. We say if they don't want to take part, it's going to be implemented in the Eurozone. This is actually the German policy, because we want to start. This is what social movements talked about 20 years ago. It's quite interesting that now the conservative governments take this idea over. Yet this path of an elite construction and development of Europe pushes the paradox of a Europe without Europeans, a Europe without Europeans, to an extreme. Even more, the citizens of lender nations, those nations which borrow money, regard themselves as being robbed. Germans think they're just taking our pockets. The other ones are being robbed. And those countries who have to take money see themselves as citizens of borrower nations, see themselves as being disenfranchised. They lose their dignity and their sovereignty. For both, Europe is turning into an enemy. Instead of a Europe of citizens, an angry civic movement against Europe is taking shape. So here, my third and last questions. This is the third one. You have to take, you count yourself and just. What Europe do we want? And my answer is, let's create the Europe of the citizen now. US President John F. Kennedy in the 60s, in 1960s, astonished the world with his idea to create a Peace Corps. By analogy, the European leaders, maybe the movements as well, should dare to surprise the world with the insight and initiative that the Euro crisis is not just about economy, but about initiating a Europeanization of Europe from below, about diversity and self-determination, about a political and cultural space in which the citizens no longer confront each other as enemies, but of European citizens to create a Europe from below. Any talk of enlargement and deepening would thereby acquire a new meaning. What would have to be enlarged and deepened would be democracy in Europe. The rule of law and the market are not sufficient. Freedom needs a third pillar if it is to become secure. Its name is European civil society, or in more concrete terms, doing Europe, or European civic activity. Such an autonomous civic practice, providing basic funding for Europeans' unemployed youth, would doubtlessly cost a pile of money.